thinking about the lessons for Catholic universities, I was listening closely to all of your remarks yesterday and trying to think about how to organize those remarks around one idea, which I'll try to convey in a minute. And I want to do this by starting and encouraging all of us to think about what it's like to be an educator in a Catholic university, what we're like as teachers. And for me, one of the greatest responsibilities as a teacher is what I not become. And that is that I not become a kind of pedagogical despot or a pedagogical demagogue, somebody who comes into the classroom and says to the students, well, I have this perspective and you should all follow it. And I think this is particularly important for our times because it's very tempting for teachers, particularly now, to convey a certain cynicism to students. For 18-year-olds, cynicism seems like clever and smart. They show up at the university, and finally this person tells them that the world has gone to hell, and he's so smart, and they should follow that. And there is this problem of demagoguery in the classroom. I think the way that we get around that is to ask ourselves not what is good for us, assuming somehow that we have privileged insight into the world, but to ask instead what is good for them, our students. What provides them with long-term perspectives that will give them hope. Give them a hope that they can go out in the world and be active participants in their countries, in their churches, in other forums, in their local settings, and not be cynics. And so after making that point, I just want to convey a general point with some examples. My general point is that we as Catholic educators need to make sure that we are not teaching on the basis of false dichotomies. It is very easy to dichotomize the world to make it simple and to say, well, there's this perspective and then other people have that perspective and it's bad. That's actually what populists do. What populists do is they portray the world as black and white. But to be a good educator is to convey to people that the world is complex, that our relations with other individuals are complex and challenging, and that there is not necessarily a satisfactory answer to every question. I think this is extremely important. And again, as part of the paradox that we might be tempted to do this, but that's what makes populism so tempting in our societies. So I'll just share some false dichotomies. The first false dichotomy is us versus them. Us versus them. In other words, here we're the true believers, and those are the people that oppose us or represent positions that are opposed to us. Well, you see a lot of this among educators in the United States because maybe not all of us, but many of us, such as myself, have, I'm trying to think of a general diplomatic way of saying this. Some of us have absolute contempt for the current president of the United States and would rather not see him in office. But to get to the false dichotomy, it's not us or me as a teacher versus Donald Trump, but it's us and my students operating in a complex world in which many people voted for Donald Trump and may continue to support him for reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with the factors that make, as in my case, us feel contempt for this particular individual. And so, as part of living in a complex world, we need to recognize that there are reasons why so many Americans voted for Donald Trump. And we need to avoid the kind of elitism that makes us think, well, these are just uneducated people. The second false dichotomy is between religion and secularism. It's very easy and tempting for us to say, well, we're at religious institutions and therefore we have this special path to truth, and secular institutions don't have that. So we're better than they are. But as I was thinking in listening to the discussions yesterday and learning from them, we have to be careful about what we mean by this term religion. What does it mean to be religious? What is the role of religion in our societies? And I'll give you a quick example of this. I consider myself to be a religious person. I'm glad that religion is strong in the United States. But it depends. So the quick example is my wife and I were at the Grand Canyon in Arizona, and I don't know if any of you have, if some of you have seen the Grand Canyon, maybe all of you, but it's this unfathomable, just inconceivable split in the earth, which, when you look at it, you have a hard time understanding what it means. And so we were looking at a plaque that was designed for children. And the plaque said, this strata is 50 million years old. This strata is 100 million years old. These fossils can be found here. Woolly mammoths can be found there. And we were thinking how good this is for children. And a man and his children came up behind us, and the man looked at this and he said, well, you know, the scientists, these particular scientists have it all wrong. He said, they're just not up to date. And I looked at him and I thought, so is it even older than they say? And I said, how old would you say the Grand Canyon is? And he said, well, about 6,000 years. And, you know, this is just totally perplexing to me, how somebody can regard the Grand Canyon as 6,000 years old. Now, as a matter of faith and his religious expression, then perhaps the Grand Canyon is 6,000 years old. And I'm not going to question his religious faith, but in the societies and the modern societies that we live in, if we assume that the Grand Canyon in all cases from a scientific standpoint is 6,000 years old, then we can no longer educate our students or do business with each other because there's some things that just aren't true in terms of the scientific method, not necessarily in terms of faith. And on a personal note, I'll say, I don't believe that the Grand Canyon is only 6,000 years old. But this says something about religion versus secular society. The third has to do with liberal democracy versus religion. And this was part of our discussion yesterday that I enjoyed very much because there's a temptation to think that, well, liberal democracy and Catholicism, Catholic education, must somehow be at odds. And certainly in some cases they are. And I know that when we had a meeting a few years ago in Rome, one of the things that we talked about is how a liberal democratic perspective can lead us to, one kind of liberal perspective can lead us to denigrate religion. That doesn't mean that that's always the case. And I think what we're recognizing today in Europe and in the United States is that without a liberal democratic society, without a liberal democratic political order, it's hard to imagine that Catholic education could be possible, or a high-quality Catholic education. The fourth is European unification. I'm very glad that this was brought up yesterday. At the same meeting, we talked about how sometimes people can look at European unification when it is most starkly expressed in terms of rules and regulations as being, as providing a sort of lack of respect for religious expression. And certainly there are many, many cases in which that is true. But now, in a time where the idea of a unified Europe is in question, is really in doubt, we must ask ourselves, well, can we afford this false dichotomy between religion and Europe? Because Europe is one of the key concepts and represents major institutions that has made possible the coexistence of different forms of religion. And European unification has led to a melding of national interests and to a level of cooperation and communication among different peoples and states, which is practically unparalleled in history. So no false dichotomy between Europe and religion. And finally, Catholic and university. As a member of the Notre Dame faculty in my travels over the years, sometimes I've run into people who've said, Catholic university, that's a total contradiction in terms. You're either Catholic or you're university. You can't be united. It's an oxymoron. Yeah, you can't possibly be united. Well, if that false dichotomy has truth to it, then we're all in trouble in this room. And in fact, one of the things that we all know is that a Catholic education can add to and supplement and invigorate a regular secular form of education, and that modernity and Catholicism, and we've seen this historically, are perfectly compatible. And so it's extremely important for all of us not to put ourselves into a corner and say, well, we're special, we have a privileged conception of truth, and all of those other people, well, they don't really know how the world is. So for this reason too, and again from an educational standpoint, from a pedagogical standpoint, we need to encourage our students to recognize that these simplifications are part of what's wrong, and that any professor who lives a life within these simplifications is communicating something to them that will make it impossible for them to be responsible citizens, and will also make it very difficult for them as citizens to go out and express our cherished values in a liberal society.